At the top of the show, we discussed how the president is getting rid of people who testified against him during the impeachment hearings. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman and Ambassador to the EU Gordon Sondland, they were the first to go. The president, in a major mob move, seemingly got rid of Vindman's twin brother, well, just because. Now, Chuck Schumer, he wants an investigation into what and why Trump is doing this. He sent a letter to the Defense Department's Inspector General saying that those firings are, quote, part of a dangerous growing pattern of retaliation against those who report wrongdoing, only to find themselves targeted by the president and subject to his wrath and vindictiveness. Now, also, you'll be happy to know, apparently Rudy Giuliani still on the job in his case here to fight corruption in Ukraine. What could possibly go wrong? Well, here's Lindsey Graham, of all people, describing what Rudy is doing and how Attorney General Bill Barr, the AG, is helping him out.
The Department of Justice is receiving information coming out of the Ukraine from Rudy
already.
To see, he told me that they have created a process that Rudy could give information and they would see if it's verified.
I want to bring in our next guest, who's the perfect person to talk about this with, former Congressman Brad Miller, Democrat from North Carolina. He's now with a law firm that focuses on whistleblower protections, and I want to get to a second both Vindman and Sondland, but first, it's out in the open right now. That's what strikes me out of some of this. You know, I went back and I looked at the testimony that Barr gave to Congress after the Mueller report, and there was an exchange with Senator Kamala Harris and him where she asked him, has the administration pressured DOJ at all to do any investigations, the implication being against the political rival or someone else? And he hemmed and he hawed, and the definition of is kind of, there was that moment there, Congressman. Now, yeah, sure, we're going to do it. I'm going to get Rudy to basically have a direct pipeline to me at DOJ, and we're going to go into it. There isn't even the pretense of trying to dance around the thing. I think the conclusion they came to after impeachment was, who cares? We're just going to do this, whatever we want to do till November, and we dare anyone to call us out on it.
Yeah, Barr has taken this position for a very long time. He has a very extreme view of the powers of the president. He calls them illimitable. The whole idea of American constitutional system is that no powers are illimitable. There are limits on every power that the Constitution gives. But he has argued since the George H.W. Bush administration, or maybe the Reagan administration, that the president has powers over the executive branch. He can hire, he can fire, whistleblower protections, career protections, whatever else don't matter. He can fire for any reason or for no reason. And he's recently argued, just in the last 2 or 3 years, that the powers of the president over criminal prosecutions is just as illimitable. He can tell prosecutors not to pursue charges against his friends. He can tell them to find charges to bring against his enemies. This is pretty creepy. This is not really how a democracy is supposed to work.
And to that end, I get that the president, his probably favorite person is Colonel Vindman. I also know he probably didn't love the testimony that Ambassador Sondland gave, but Sondland was subpoenaed. He testified under oath. No one has said he's, fictionalized any of his testimony. There's paper trails, Lord knows, here, and even ear witnesses to conversations that all bear all this out. And in the case of Vindman, he followed the protocol. I haven't heard anyone say he didn't follow what he was supposed to do when he was party or heard of that conversation. To my end, okay, the president doesn't like it, but this is just pure payback. And then to fire his twin brother just because it really, I jokingly said this in the intro, but it feels like, a Don gets acquitted here, and now he's basically rubbing out anybody in the organization that he thinks wasn't loyal.
Yeah, I'm going to hurt you and I'm going to hurt your family. That's really not what we've had in this country, not what well-functioning democracies have. That's not a power that we recognize that our presidents should have. Yeah, it's obviously retaliation. He's pretty much said as much. Not pretty much. He has flat out said as much. He's punishing them for testimony that was disloyal to him and that he said was false. Although their testimony checks out with every available shred of evidence. It is not unfair or extreme to call it payback or retaliation or purge, as it's been called. And there is a criminal statute that retaliation against a witness for their testimony or an informant is a crime. And several law enforcement, several prosecutors have said since Vindman and Sondland were fired that their firing violates that statute.
But doesn't it seem that now, beyond the chilling effect that this is going to have if somebody else witnesses something that they find to be, highly improper here, that they're going to think twice before they come forward? I mean, careers have been ruined. I mean, look at what happened to Ambassador Yovanovitch here, if anybody needs Exhibit A for this. And more than that, I think the lesson that's been taken away by the people that remain in this administration, now that whatever good cops that were left this situation, that they're going to do this with impunity. And I love Susan Collins when she says, I hope he learned his lesson. And then within the same actual news cycle, he comes out and says, I did nothing wrong. So clearly they're going to keep trying it again. And now seemingly with, if not the blessing, but even the assistance of the Department of Justice, nobody, I'm just saying, Congressman, can turn around in November and say, I can't believe he did that. Of course you should be able to. There's no more shock and awe.
No, well, Susan Collins didn't say she hoped he heard his lesson. She said she thought he had learned his lesson. And then she had to say, well, that was aspirational. I mean, she looked pretty foolish in all of that. I mean, I think we clearly know what we've got now in President Trump. I think we've known it for a while. And really all that stands between democracy and dictatorship anywhere is the willingness of the armed forces, of law enforcement, of prosecutors to obey lawful orders and to disobey unlawful orders. And President Trump is removing people who disobey unlawful orders.
While I got you, I want to ask some both policy questions and political. And the first policy question is, if you closed your eyes and you heard a president putting out a budget right after we went more than $1 trillion in the red, okay? And then you hear another budget's coming out equally fiscally Looney Tunes, you'd swear this is Republicans screaming that some Democrat here is spending money they don't have here, the PAYGO party. But I'm hearing crickets from the GOP. And on top of that, he says in the State of the Union, let's play the bite here, that 2 treasured programs, aren't going to be touched.
I've also made an ironclad pledge to American families. We will always protect patients with pre-existing conditions. And we will always protect your Medicare, and we will always protect your Social Security, always.
I don't want to let facts get in the way of a good story, but the administration is literally signed on to a lawsuit to throw out the total Affordable Care Act with no solution, one, on pre-existing conditions, and secondly, he put out something today that definitely is going to target Medicare. Forget it, also food stamps and other programs, but Medicare is also potentially on the chopping block. Again, I've given up hoping that maybe some of your old colleagues from the other side of the aisle will call him out on something that used to be bedrock principles of the GOP, but it's unrecognizable, I'd imagine, for you, even though you're still in D.C., what's happened to the GOP?
It's old news now. It's hardly even worth noting that he says things and then says something completely different just a day or two later. Even though he may describe it as an ironclad guarantee, you obviously should know that you can't count on it at all. That's just who he is, and I don't know that there's anybody in America who shouldn't know that by now.
I got it, but they shut down the government numerous times when you were there because they wanted a balanced budget. They did not want to spend money we didn't have. I mean, that's the whole advent of, remember, the Tea Party movement and everything else. Now, talk about catgut your tongue. I don't hear anything.
No, that was always insincere. I hate to question people's motives, but it was insincere. They didn't really mean it. They never meant it. They never were really against or never were really worried about the deficit. They were never really worried about, long-term deficits or short-term deficits. They were always for cutting programs because they just didn't want those programs. And they were always for cutting taxes because they just wanted the richest people to have less in taxes. It's not really about the deficit. It never was.
Congressman Miller, I really appreciate the time today as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, before we wrap up this segment, I wanted to bring you some stories that show just how batty things are in this White House. And I want to start with yet another increase in the number of U.S. service members who suffered traumatic brain injuries after Iran retaliated when they struck American bases in Iraq. CNN is now reporting that more than 100 people received head injuries from those airstrikes. The president and the Pentagon originally said no one was hurt. Then, about a week later, when confronted with some of these injuries, the administration acknowledged that 11 Americans were treated for concussions. In subsequent weeks, that number it kept climbing, and we learned that several people, they had to be flown to Germany for treatment. But again, when pressed, the president has continued to downplay the injuries. Here he was a few weeks ago doing just that.
I heard that they had headaches and a couple of other things, but I would say, and I can report, it is not very serious. No, I don't consider them very serious injuries relative to other injuries that I've seen.
Again, more than 100 with traumatic brain injuries. Now, to another story involving our military. A Democratic congressional staffer, who's also a Navy veteran, I may add, reported that she was sexually assaulted at a VA hospital in Washington last year. Now, the committee that she works for says that senior officials at the VA have attempted to discredit her claim. NBC News says VA Secretary Robert Wilkie, he was even involved when he began to gather information about the victim's history, hoping to find something that could be used to undermine her claims. Again, the head of the VA. For their part, both the VA and Wilkie are denying these claims. Now, we wrap up with some later stories. Now, remember this moment from the State of the Union address last week?
I can proudly announce tonight that an opportunity scholarship has become available. It's going to you, and you will soon be heading to the school of your choice.
In a seemingly made-for-TV moment, the president bragging that the little girl was going to be getting a scholarship to attend an elite charter school of her choice. The president made it happen. What the president failed to mention, however, was that little Janiyah, she already goes to a top-notch charter school well before the State of the Union. Now, perhaps the worst part was that probably only about the fifth or sixth lie at the State of the Union would be that one here. There were much bigger whoppers before that. Now, we're going to close this segment out on this one. Orange turns out to be the new tan. We already know about the president's oddly orange complexion, but these photos taken while he walked across the White House lawn last week add a whole set of questions to what is going on with the commander-in-chief's face. The tan lines are odd, to say the least. So is that unique hue. Trump, of course, responded where else but on Twitter. Again, this is our president, more fake news. This was photoshopped, obviously, but the wind was strong and the hair looks good. Anything to demean. We can call this one Tangate and hope we don't ever have to see the pictures again, let alone cover them. All right, when we come back, Joe Biden's campaign, it is limping into New Hampshire as he struggles in the polls, and he also tries to bounce back from a drubbing in Iowa. But if Biden fizzles out, do the Dems have a viable plan B?